Assalamu alaikum and good evening. Welcome to another episode of the Classics show. I am your host, Shabnum Riaz. As always, I start the show always with the same thing, and I sort of think, I should say something else. But it's exactly what comes out of the heart, actually. It's, this is that time of the week when we're able to sit down and discuss those things that are being neglected throughout this fast-paced world. So to sit down to talk about the classics, literature, arts, music, it's a fantastic privilege. And today we're going to talk about Toni Morrison. Who was Toni Morrison? Well, she was an American novelist, an editor, a professor. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature and also the Pulitzer Prize as well. So to find out more about Toni Morrison, we're very happy to have with us here in the studios our guest, Dr. Jaleel Akhter, who's an assistant professor from Classsics in Lahore. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaleel, for joining us here today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Okay, right. So as we're going to talk about, Toni Morrison, her works, who exactly, she was and what she stood for, let's start with her childhood. What shaped her becoming who she was?
Toni Morrison is an African-American Nobel Prize winner writer, and she is one of the most prolific one. She grew up in Lorain, Ohio. Her early childhood is there. Her family was part of the Great Migration. They moved from the South and settled down in North, hoping to find a better future for their children. Mm-hmm. And I can recall that for Toni Morrison, it was struggle on part of her family to fund her education. She remembers attending one of the integrationist school when she was growing up. Mm-hmm. And later on, she moved to Harvard University, where she studied under the tutelage of the famous Harlem Renaissance writer Alain Locke, who is famously known for his book, the anthology he compiled, The New Negro. And he also wrote the famous essay, The New Negro. That became an iconic in the sense it anticipated the zeitgeist to come. It anticipated the civil rights movement, the African American or the black arts movement. And I think to a great extent, it also influenced the post-black arts.
Right.
The culmination of the other movements to follow as well. For example, the post-soul movement, or even the post-blackness, are the new black schools of thoughts, I should say. Because Alain Locke talks about the new Negro, and Toni Morrison in her most famous, the most contemporary novel, God Help the Child, she talks about the new black, which is written in the context of, I would say, post-black arts, post-blackness, post-soul, and the new black contexts or movements. And they all, in retrospect, they can trace their linealogy or development or evolution to Alain Locke's The New Negro movement, which was about, self-empowerment, regeneration at social level, not only at individual level. It was about the new Negro who was an empowered being. It carried a notion of subjectivity that wasn't beholden to old stereotypical notions of the old black. Right. That was a subject of derision. That was a subject of inferiority.
Degradation.
And degradation, yeah.
In fact, also, during her early childhood, her parents were very active in narrating the African-American folklore. So the importance of storytelling and
that was central.
Yeah, and also the importance of storytelling, not just in Toni Morrison's case, we'll talk about that as well, but in general as well, how important that is to keep children acclimatized with a world they may not be able to identify with at that time.
That's very good question. Toni Morrison grew up in a very nurturing environment. She received her art of storytelling from her mother, from her grandmother. So storytelling was part of the tradition of that household. It was part of the folklore, and obviously it traces back its roots to African folklore, African myths and cosmos, to use a broad expression. And that was to shape up the psychological makeup of this potential author who was to later on become Toni Morrison, the author, the Nobel laureate. So I think, yes, her early upbringing was very nurturing in that sense. Especially, I would say that her first tutor was perhaps her mother and her ancestors. And she does tend to affirm the existence of, or the presence, or the influence of ancestors in an individual's life, including herself. And then she warns against, disconnecting yourself from your elders, or even from their spirits, who are a kind of guiding principle. For Toni Morrison, it was her mother, it was her grandmother, it was the spirits of her ancestors, if you will.
Because again, we're talking about identity. We're talking about, where a person belongs to. And if it's so easy to give up your roots, to give up, exactly where your ancestors came from, in a way you're not being true to yourself. So that was also a very interesting thing as well. Now, when we're talking about storytelling, is being a good storyteller one of the first steps towards being a good writer?
Storytelling is an art. It can be an acquired art. It can be cultivated. It can be a God-gifted gift. But it comes with some really vigorous exercise. This is my personal point of view.
And
in
as you
Toni
said,
Morrison's
some
case,
natural storytellers,
yes,
as you're saying, that's gifted.
In Toni Morrison's case, she was an avid reader of classical literature. When she was at Harvard, and let me remind you, her MA from Cornell University, she majored in classics, and her MA thesis was on Virginia Woolf's and William Faulkner's treatment of the alienated. And in her thesis, she talks about the influence of classical literature on these writers. And she talks about the classical concept of transgenerational ghosts or phantoms haunting the present generations, or the generations in the fiction of their fiction of these two writers I mentioned. And then I think she plays around these concepts of the classical concept or the Greek concept that sins of the parents visit upon children.
Right.
So this concept, although on the face of it sounds very archaic, but it's got very contemporary resonance, relevance. For example, modern contemporary psychoanalytic theory, it talks about transgenerational hauntings or transgenerational phantoms. And Toni Morrison literature is being studied in the context of this theory.
As you mentioned Howard University, where she enrolled, one of the reasons was that she said she wanted to be around Black intellectuals. And in fact, that, in her time there as well, that was where she encountered racial segregation as well. So how, on a sensitive personality as she was, how did she absorb all this into her writings? And, let's discuss that part.
This sounds very ironic to me, because Harvard University was by then an all-Black university. So for me, it would be really questionable if she found some kind of segregation there. I do remember when she was a school-going student and she was trying to tutor a young kid who had Caucasian background. It was part of her assignment. And then all of a sudden, she realized that when that young Caucasian guy, he knew that Toni Morrison is Negro or Black, he quickly disidentified himself from her. And I think probably that might be one of her earliest experience or insight into, to use an expression, racial interpolation, the first originary experience of racism for her.
She then went on to becoming an editor at Random House, and in fact she was one of the first black women to come into a senior position as editor there. That gave her a huge platform and the capacity where she then brought forward a lot of black literature, did she not?
That's true. Random House is a world-renowned press, and I think it was a great opportunity for Toni Morrison to introduce the lesser-known black writers. For example, she patronized the work of Toni Cade Bambara and even lesser-known writers, poets like Henry Dumas. And she even commissioned the autobiography of Muhammad Ali, the boxer.
Yes, exactly.
The greatest. And then she edited quite a few anthology, most notably the Black Book. And then she went on, it was an ongoing relationship with the Random House, and obviously the same press later on patronized Toni Morrison's work as well. Toni Morrison wanted to build up a canon or a platform, to use your expression, for the emerging African American writers. You know, that was her efforts, and she did succeed in building up a canon for African American writers.
Exactly. As you just said, let's talk about Muhammad Ali's biography. What was one of the notable things
that's
there?
a small humorous episode. Toni Morrison was commissioned with this assignment. She was to conduct an interview with the greatest, Muhammad Ali. And then because of Muhammad Ali's faith, you know, she was aware that she needs to perhaps adapt herself according to Muhammad Ali's Muslim faith, because he was reputed not only to be unpredictable, but quite often he refused to have, in present case, to have his interview conducted by Toni Morrison. So maybe she brought about some modesty. That's how what she recalls, that she changed her, she brought about some certain kind of decorum in order, as per the requirement of his Muslim faith. And then she also arranged for a small baby, because Muhammad Ali was reputed to indulge in moments of humor, lighter moments, especially if there is a kid around. So that was to appease his, you know, that
To
being
bring out
impulsive,
his-
because that's how
okay.
he was reputed to be by then when he was growing up.
Because he was also a famous wit and very, very
Yes.
eloquent, very, very famous speaker as well.
Yes.
So that must have been, you know, she must have been in awe as well. of
Yeah, and
taking
Toni
all this.
Morrison, she didn't want to offend his sensibility. She fully respected that. So
Okay. Right, now, you mentioned the Black Book. Tell us about that. What exactly was that, the Black Book?
I think the Black Book was Toni Morrison's effort in it's kind of an archaeological project, if I could use this term.
Okay.
Because it's an effort in archiving or documenting centuries of black history.
That had gone unnoticed.
Yes. Yeah, unnoticed.
Right.
And it was important for her because it had to do with a span of history which she considered to be very important, which she thought that wasn't given due attention or projection in the media. And then she compiled that anthology. It was very graphic. It had excerpts from newspapers, clippings from newspapers, from media, from encyclopedias. And this book, the anthology, it became really actually famous for that small excerpt she included. Margaret Garner's story, a clipping from newspaper in which there is a story about this woman who murders her child in order to protect her from slavery. And that clipping is from the mid-19th century, or maybe a decade later on. And then that laid the foundation. It was the genesis for her most famous novel, Beloved.
Beloved, yes, exactly.
And, yeah.
And to imagine the turmoil of a mother to go against her maternal instincts, to do something like that, speaks so much of, you know, what a disturbed soul she was and what she had been facing.
That's really very disturbing, traumatizing to think about the complexity of mother-daughter relationship. If we study that, let's say, in the context of Beloved or outside of that context, Toni Morrison's projection of mother-daughter relationship, they are impacted by culture, by forces of history, by traumas of racism, by slavery, you know, which are really, really overwhelming. So you have to look at these questions of responsibility, whether or not you are a responsible parent, right? And then I like this expression which one of Toni Morrison's famous critic, Jean Wyatt, she uses, that it's got to do with aporetics of motherhood. Aporetics is from aporia, from Greek. It's a Greek expression. It's especially made famous by Jacques Derrida. There is a book by him called Aporias. And aporia has to do with facing moral dilemmas in which you are not in a position to decide which action or which suitable course of action you can adopt. It has to do with, you know, it's an experience of finding yourself in a kind of cul-de-sac, if you will. It's a kind of blind alley.
Okay.
So there is a certain imperative, you don't know whether to condemn someone's actions or to approve of them.
Okay.
It confounds your rational imagination. So you cannot rationalize a mother's, you know, decision to murder her child. Because in her thinking, in her mind, that's the best suitable or available course of action she can take, right? As per Margaret and as per Beloved's mother, you know, the fictive character Seth in Beloved, she says that was the best suitable action, a course of action she had. She wanted to put her daughter in a place of safety.
So tragic. Something very interesting now, something that I think, you know, we're going to have a lot to talk about. The Bluest Eye.
Right.
The theme behind that book may seem to some people as, you know, just an exploration of beauty, but it's not. It's so much more. And again, it's not just limited to the African American community.
That's true.
Let's discuss that. What led her to write about The Bluest Eye? Because it was something that, that actually happened to her that gave her this idea.
The Bluest Eye is Toni Morrison's first novel, written when she was 39 years of age or so. She was conducting some creative writing workshops. But the idea of this novel comes from her biographical life, if you will. She encountered a young girl who desired to have the bluest eye. And she had been constantly praying to God that she be rewarded with her prayer or this desire. Because in her thinking, now this is very innocent or naive wish on part of a young child to desire the bluest eye. Because in her thinking, that makes her beautiful, that makes her more desirable, more acceptable. But then Toni Morrison, she turns around and she thinks that what if God has or God had actually granted her wish? She thought it would make her really a grotesque creature. In Toni Morrison's eyes, she was really a beautiful little girl, but she didn't realize it. And then she turned this encounter into that marvelous, first novel, The Bluest Eye.
Tell us about, what she said about the Western concept of beauty as well.
Okay, so I'm going to connect it with The Bluest Eye because in the novel there is this remarkable expression. The narrator turns around and she says that the concept of beauty is perhaps the most destructive concept the West has ever invented. So I might have paraphrased this line from the text, The Bluest Eye, and in plenty of her interviews and non-fiction, Toni Morrison cautions us against the dangers of adopting Eurocentric standards of beauty.
Exactly.
And it's so obvious from our society as well, we observe it. We tend to import cultural standards or norms of beauty which belong to some other culture, which are Eurocentric and
which are not relevant.
Yeah, they're relevant.
They're not relevant to us. So, this is a very, very fascinating exploration, exactly what Toni Morrison has done.
And I think, her fiction continues to posit us this question. What happens if we do actually import these cultural norms of beauty? If we do tend to internalize them, do they become an expression of racial self-loathing? Does it reflect some kind of inferiority complex? Does it expose some kind of inherent deficiency in us? Low self-opinion? So I think these are very important questions we've got to ask ourselves.
And in fact, the answer to those questions is probably yes.
Embrace yourself.
Yeah.
Stay natural to yourself. Don't lose. Don't try to be artificial, Beautify yourself in a sense that really enhances your personality.
Exactly. And what she did actually was real genius, because at the same time she's talking about identity, at the same time she's talking about heritage, she's talking about being proud of where you've come from, and to not allow anyone to make you feel inferior, which was another quote as well, that nobody can make you feel inferior unless you give your consent. So she's also talking about that as well. The concept of beauty, like she's talking about this young girl who wants blue eyes, something that is not something that is very, common in African Americans. So she's saying that wanting to lose a part of yourself to fit in elsewhere makes you a misfit in both sort of societies. And if you think of how that concept has damaged so many people living in this region of the world, it's played havoc. It's wreaked havoc with young girls who are, and not just the girls, in fact, their families, who are looking towards their daughters or females in a family, and who are complexed because of their complexion.
Right.
So how is that addressed, and how is that?
I think we can stretch this concept. I think Toni Morrison's formula, Toni Morrison's this theory that beauty is the most destructive concept which we've imported, I think it transcends culture. And it transcends gender as well. Within African American society, we have the famous example, Michael Jackson, he wanted to whiten his skin. And then he became an object of criticism within the circle of African American society.
Exactly, because he disassociated himself. They saw it that way, that you're giving up
a part of yourself. You were not being authentic to yourself.
So again, we're talking about, fair skin and the obsession with darker skinned people. Where does that come from? How does this all fit in together?
This is interesting. I think Toni Morrison would tend to probably associate it with, again, importation of cultural images, which become the norm bearers, if you will. For example, in the bluest eye, you know, that blue-eyed doll is a symbol of Shirley Thomas, a Hollywood actress, actor, if you will. And she was a symbol by then of a norm of beauty, acceptance. Although these norms tend to change with the passage of time. For example, in God Help the Child, you know, being black and true to your own self rather than making yourself exotic by importing grotesque imagery. Staying true to your own self has become an expression of your true identity.
Exactly. You find many people saying that one of the most beautiful parts of a person is their self-confidence.
Self-acceptance, self-confidence.
Exactly, and that comes from, as you just said, self-acceptance. And here again, Morrison is making that connection because she's saying that, you know, until you love yourself, until you love who you are, where you have come from, you're not going to feel beautiful from inside. And if you don't feel beautiful from inside, then you are actually not going to be happy with whatever cosmetic changes you make to yourself. So that's a very important point that she's making, isn't it?
That's very true.
Okay. She talks about connection, she talks about alienation, she talks about why the human being desires to fit in.
Right. That's again very interesting. This desire to fit in, probably when you find yourself in a society, you know, that's based upon a structure of exclusion, or a society which is based upon a structure of hierarchies, you know, and you are trying to make your way in based upon your efforts, upon your merits, all right, and then that society is not allowing you that room.
It's not accepting you.
Yeah, to make your voice feel heard, you know. That's where you think that perhaps you are a misfit, you are like a foreigner. And this is Toni Morrison's point in her most recent fiction, Like a Mercy, God Help the Child. You know, we are, all of us, we are in a sense foreigners, and we are trying to make ourselves at home.
Absolutely, yeah. And also, in a way, we're all pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The last piece, looking for that jigsaw puzzle, where we're going to fit in. So another element of this
That's part of the diversity.
Exactly.
Right.
So another part of this is the inclusion.
Yes.
And that's something that you can go back to childhood and you can remember in your early days, you know, first day at school. The thing that you know, haunted you the most was that going to school and what if I don't have any friends?
That's very true. So Toni Morrison advocates, I wouldn't say a very utopian picture of society. She advocates a society in which all of us, we can maintain our differences, our individual differences, and still not being shamed for it, for standing for who we are.
So again, a very important message, tolerance.
Tolerance.
That's something as well that she's, you know, talking about.
Yeah, she dreams of a of a more democratic world. In her very famous essay, Home, not the book or the novel Home, she dreams of visualizing a world, and she characterizes it as a racist, but at the same time, non-racist home. This sounds very paradoxical. A house that is racist, but at the same time, it's a non-racist home, because in it, all of us, we can live an existence of mutual harmony, coexistence, despite being different from each other.
Which again is the basics of society, because that's where it all starts from.
Right.
So we'll get back to this fantastic conversation. We're going for a break right now. Don't change the channel.
Is that you?
What's left?
How long has it been?
18 years. What kind of evil you got in there?
It ain't evil, just sad.
Do you have a ghost here, you know?
Can't be easy. A young girl living in a haunted place.
Got a tree on my back and I hang in my house. Nothing in between but the daughter I'm holding in my arms.
I'm a grown man. Nothing new left to see or do. We get...
What might your name be?
Beloved.
What you looking for when you come here, beloved?
I look for this place I could be. I think the baby got plans.
A baby? No, it's grown. It's the age it would have been had it lived. She a charmed child from the beginning.
It's clear why she hold on to you. I just can't see why you holding on to her.
You won't ever leave us, will you?
Don't tell me what to do.
But I'm on your side.
She the one. Here in this place, we are flesh. Flesh that weeps, laughs, dances barefoot in the grass. No running from nothing, because I'd rather know my children are living at peace in heaven than living a hell here on earth. So help me, Jesus.
Me and my woman's planning on starting a new life. Nobody's gonna own us no more. Nobody's gonna own my children either.
No matter what happened, God has led you home. You came back to me.
I know.
Okay, welcome back to the programme, and we're having a fantastic conversation about Toni Morrison. Dr. Jaleel, tell me, what made you connect with Toni Morrison? And, you know, if I could put it this way, what about her made, you know, her words stir your soul?
Personal question, I think, but I have to answer it. Toni Morrison, she made a beautiful statement that narrative or storytelling, the art of fiction writing, remains the best medium way to understand anything. Theology, history, your own self, self-knowledge. And I think when I first encountered Toni Morrison, when I was reading her fiction, I thought her fiction was replete with characters who were undergoing some kind of psychosomatic experiences. For example, a common characteristic of her characters or characterization is that the characters are kind of exploding, their bodies are falling apart. They face some kind of fragmentation. But I tend to use this expression dismemberment. For me, that fragmentation is more literal, it's more graphic, it's more evocative. It doesn't have to do with psychosomatic experiences alone. Some Toni Morrison's critics, they tend to read an element of supernaturalism in her fiction. But for me, I think that was part of her storytelling, art of fiction writing I could identify with. When I was growing up, I thought that I was undergoing some kind of fragmentation. And I thought by studying Toni Morrison's fiction, perhaps I could get to know about myself. As Toni Morrison, you know, recently in her MLA convention, she made this beautiful statement that the art of storytelling, it is fierce, it is incendiary, it's explosive, it's loaded. But what I really like about this statement, and I might be changing her expression, the use of the expression that the art of storytelling, it makes you coherent, or it is coherent. It gives you a sense of identity. It endows you with a sense of subjectivity. And that comes through exposure. Exposure to her literature in my case. And that offers a window through which you can kind of self-examine yourself. And as Toni Morrison has said, that the human psyche is really complex. There are multiple layers.
Absolutely.
About her characters, their psychic motivation. And yes, there is an aspect of it that you can identify with. Recently, Muhyiddin made a very interesting observation, and that's with reference to Shakespeare's Hamlet. He said that there is an element, or there is a facet of Hamlet in all of us. So I think the same can be said about Toni Morrison's character or her fiction. Her stories are not about a black girl, you know, who is living in Lorain, Ohio. It's not entirely about her own subjective experiences, her own experiences of growing up as a black girl in Ohio. I think the novels, they tend to transcend the context, the ethos in which they are written.
Absolutely.
So they do carry a certain universal appeal.
Absolutely.
Although they are written within the specificity of, let's say, African American context, you know, but still there is an aspect you can connect with.
That's absolutely true, and that's exactly the word I was going to use, appeal. Is it not the biggest success for an author to be able to connect with a person at a personal level when something else is being discussed or another subject is being narrated? I mean, that is genius, isn't it?
That's so true. Toni Morrison has been time and again asked this question: why don't you write about white people? There are very few white characters in her novels. And then she turns around, and this is her very famous statement coming from one of her interviews, that she didn't ask Leo Tolstoy or Dostoevsky to write for a young girl growing up in Ohio. And this is being self-referential when she was growing up. But she connected with their literature. So that's part of the genius of Russian literature. All right, so part of genius of any writer for that matter, or his success or her success, lies in the fact that it transcends boundaries, it transcends culture, it transcends certain geopolitical backgrounds.
That's so true. Okay, now let's talk about creative writing. You will find many people who have the skill, who want to nurture it more. What are your tips in indulging in creative writing? And then after that, we'll talk about literature and its therapeutic power.
Right. Creative writing is an acquired art, very rigorous exercise. It can be mastered. With reference to Toni Morrison, she mentions, you know, how she started her career as a creative writer, that she wanted to read a piece of fiction that related to her. And unfortunately, she couldn't find a novel or a story she could connect with. And then this is her piece of advice for aspiring creative writers, that if you think that there isn't any literature, now I'm not gonna make a general or sweeping statement here, right? If you think that you cannot connect with a certain author, then probably you've got to write your own story. You need to narrate your own self into existence. So that's Toni Morrison's advice for creative or aspiring writers.
Right. And what about, you know, your teaching as well, you're teaching your students. What are you telling them in forms of creating writing? And also, you know, in finding your own voice, because that's all, again, related to your identity and who you are and your acceptance of your own being.
When I teach Toni Morrison's fiction, I try to engage my students critically. I want them to use their discretion I want them to exercise their judgment, to bring about a critical perspective, the way they read Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison, her novels are dialogic. They are very interactive. It's a kind of participatory exercise. Some critics, they say that there is a call and response in Toni Morrison's fiction. It's just like, you know, you see someone standing at a podium, at a pulpit, or giving some kind of sermon, and you are trying to listen to his call. So the storyteller, he acquires the persona of a storyteller. He's trying to call you on a site where you can find a connection, you know, where you can link with him or her. It's a kind of participatory experience. You know, this medium of communication, the art of storytelling, it engages you in a sense that sharpens your critical thinking, your faculties.
Which is, again, so important. Okay, now let's talk about literature with its therapeutic powers and healing powers, and art as well. What does it have to offer?
I refer back to Toni Morrison and her statement that the art of storytelling, you know, it endows you with a sense of subjectivity. It is coherent. It exposes your vulnerabilities. You know, it offers you a medium via which you can have a look inside your own self and get to know your own self in a better way, have a better awakening, self-knowledge. And she describes the art of literature, the art of storytelling, you know, as an exercise, as a process of journey from ignorance to enlightenment. It's a kind of journey you embark upon. It's kind of self-revelatory, I think.
Okay.
You get to know yourself in a way, perhaps, you were not used to.
So, you know, there is a sort of a saying that the greatest art is the one that causes disturbances inside. Maybe the calmness with which you are carrying yourself, you come across something, a powerful piece of writing, a painting, a depiction, a piece of music, a sonnet, and all of a sudden time stops.
Right.
And that hits you hard.
Right.
What about that?
That's a correct observation. You said that the great art makes you feel uncomfortable. It takes the ground off your feet, right? I think a great piece of art both makes you feel at home and not being at home with your own self.
True.
Or with the experience of reading a literature. You know, you read a piece of writing, as it were, it offers you a vision of reality that you are not used to see, hear, or watch. It opens different avenues of thinking, of imagination.
It's sort of a out-of-body experience, isn't it? Because there you are, all comfortable and everything, and then you come across something that does stir this emotion. Sometimes it can be a lot of things that are buried deep inside your subconscious.
That's so true. For example, Toni Morrison's writing is dubbed as traumatic or traumatizing. It is a traumatizing experience. That's why I tend to use this expression. It, you know, subjects you a certain kind of violence, if you will, because the imagery is so discomforting, right? It disorientates you, it revolts you, it jolts you into your senses, bringing up new awakenings.
Right. What about the importance of her writings in today's America?
In today's America, I think the question of immigration, foreigners, of being the other that has become alienation. That's still a very contemporary debate. It's become part of the U.S. foreign policy. You know, there is a de facto ban on immigrants coming from certain backgrounds,
certain countries.
There is certain kind of othering, alienation. All right. So I think Toni Morrison's fiction in the context of post-Trump world, again, it stokes these questions on the nature of being foreigner. You know, you said that what is this experience of finding yourself an alien in another society that is not willing to assimilate you? And then I think it has to do with this fear of the stranger.
Fear of the stranger. So in other words, it's your own insecurities that you are dealing with.
It destabilizes your sense of belonging, your sense of your own roots, your own culture. Perhaps to a certain extent, as a foreigner, you do pose this threat to the other culture. Or perhaps it destabilizes your own sense of who you are. But to borrow an expression from Toni Morrison again, we are, in a sense, foreigners.
We are, in a sense,
and the
foreigners.
earth we inhabit is a foreigner's home. And that's the ideal. Her novels are the kind of society she envisages in her novel. They aspire to achieve. They want to establish a society which is not, again, utopian. It's a realistic, ideal, achievable, where we can coexist with each other despite our differences and diversity.
Exactly, exactly. And with that, I think that is, you know, one of the most important messages in this program, in fact, to be able to live together and embracing
the other as well.
Exactly, and embracing all those differences and respecting them
rather
too.
than profiling the others.
Exactly. Dr. Jaleel, Akhter, thank you very much for being a part of this wonderful program, and thank you so much for enlightening us with all your knowledge and expertise.
You're welcome. Thank you very much indeed.
You're very welcome. Likewise. Okay, so we come to the end of today's program. Hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. So much to learn from there, and as always we say, you know, literature, it has so much of a power to heal, a power to connect you with who you are. So stay happy until next week. Bye-bye.